So I'd like to welcome everybody to CITI. Conference, online conference, the first impressions for the new administration in Congress. What's on the next telecom, internet, and ICT agenda? Obviously, it is a timely conference since what I guess is the surprise election of Donald Trump. And From what I've learned, Mr. Trump has very few established, well-defined thoughts on telecom, internet, and ICT. So we have an opportunity perhaps today to fill up or help fill what appears to be a wide open policy agenda. We have 6 speakers today. My colleague at CITI, Ellie Noam, and then we have from Washington, from inside the Beltway, we have Harold Feld, Senior Vice President of Public Knowledge, Chris Savage, a partner and co-chair of the communications practice at the law firm of Davis Wright Tremaine, Robert D. Atkinson, no relation, who is president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Sally Wentworth, the vice president for global policy development at the Internet Society, and Scott Walston, the president and senior fellow at the Technology Policy Institute. I will have a brief bio introduction of each of our speakers. And I think we should just begin with my colleague, Ellie Noam. Ellie is a professor of economics and finance at the Columbia Business School since 1976, and the Garrett Professor of Public Policy and Business Responsibility. He is the director of CITI, a research center focusing on management and policy issues in communications, internet, and media. Ellie is a very good friend of mine. He's been an insightful and foresightful commenter on a wide range of telecom, internet, and media policies for many years. And so I think if Ellie, you would sort of set the stage for the discussions with our Washington colleagues. Ellie. And please, everyone, mute your microphones when you're not speaking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you. So this has been obviously an important election result, and we need to think about the new landscape in a constructive way. For some, this meeting might be a wake. For others, it might be a baby shower. For all of us, Donald Trump is a Rorschach test, and people read into this inkblot their fears, their hopes, their paranoias. And problem is that there is no clear philosophy, no policy specifics. If you have taken a look at Rob Atkinson's excellent summary of the positions of the two candidates, you will have seen that on the column for Trump, mostly it is no position, no position, no position, no position.
Okay.
But in some ways, perhaps that is a positive because maybe it means he's pragmatic, result-oriented. I think we know that he is not really a free market conservative, more of an industrial policy conservative. And so there's a lot of overlap with many Democrats. So there are lots of issues, and I'm not going to, other people will talk about mergers and net neutrality and zero rating and muni broadband, set-top boxes, privacy, etc. What I would like kind of to address is perhaps the two fundamental issues that he's been addressing, which is the trade issue and the jobs make America great, interrelated. Now, on the trade issues, clearly there's going to be a confrontation of some sort, tough negotiations, whatever, with exporting countries, in particular with China. This is likely to end up raising prices on consumer electronics directly or indirectly. So it will have an impact on the mobile industry. But I think more than the import issue is the export issues, because the Chinese basically have not been open to American imports. They've been engaged also in looking the other way for intellectual property ripoffs. There's import quotas of severe kind for content. Quotas also exist by Europeans, by Koreans, also severe limitations, and I'm not talking about North Korea. The Europeans have as a cornerstone for their domestic market, a country of origin principle, which means the rules of the exporting countries govern, but not so much for media stuff. And it's now moving, in fact, they're now moving to the country of destination principle for online content. And this basically all means, and I probably would take the same position if I be a European regulator or a European media firm, but for American media firms who see this as asymmetric, they're not going to like it. And my guess is that the administration of Donald Trump is not going to like it, push back. Already the country of origin principle in Europe has been jettisoned for privacy matters. And other issues in Europe are, for example, taxes, the Apple issue, the privacy issues, and so on. And there are lots of challenges. And it's kind of hard to find a common denominator except the one that American firms lose. And so this trend probably will continue, even accelerate, and partly because in the past there has been no penalty to pay. So I would expect that the US trade policies in that area will basically say, we are open if you're open. So if you're not open, we are probably going to crack down on you. The second issue, so that's on the trade. The second issue is infrastructure. And here, Trump has been making a lot of noises, and partly also, of course, he's from the construction business, about constructing infrastructure. And it does also add to that his constituency has been also rural America, part of his base. And so it is quite possible that the issues of rural infrastructure and upgrade will be high up on the agenda. Maybe the repatriation of profits from countries that he has been talking about is going to be tied to some infrastructure investments in some imaginative ways. It's always possible. On internet governance, Sal is probably going to talk to us about, and that's likely to be a hard line, much harder line than in the Obama administration. I will probably conclude now simply because we have excellent other speakers, and if the discussion merits it, I will come back, or if somebody asks questions, but I will just conclude with the observation. Before we kind of are too much, as many people are, in shock. 8 years ago, an outsider came in as an agent of change. Today, the same thing is happening. An outsider is coming in as an agent of change. So just from the other direction. So let's make it a success.
Thank you, Ellie. And I would ask if anyone has any immediate questions for Ellie, put your hand up and we'll take just one or two. I would like them to be big questions. We'll have an opportunity after all the speakers to have a general conversation, and a reminder that we are recording, that this is being recorded. Thank you. Any questions? If not, let's move on to our Washington delegation, brought to us over the internet. The first speaker will be Dr. Robert D. Atkinson. He's we are not related. We have different middle initials. And while I was serving at the FCC at the turn of the century, Rob and I were frequently confused. He was often quoted in the Washington Post, and the following morning I'd get a call from the chairman's office wondering what on earth I was saying, and I shouldn't speak to the press without approval. And I finally got everyone in the FCC to read the middle initial. Rob is the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, often known as ITIF. He's a leading thinker on innovation economics with an extensive background in technology policy. He has conducted groundbreaking research projects on technology and innovation, and advises state and national policymakers, and frequently speaks on innovation policy nationally and internationally. And before founding ITIF, Rob was vice president of the Progressive Policy Institute and director of PPI's Technology and New Economy Project. With that, I'll turn it over to Robert D. Atkinson.
Appreciate it. Actually, I remember when I started ITIF, our very first report, I got an email from you, Bob, and it said, put your initial on the report from now on, because I didn't have it. Apologize for a little background noise. I'm in a hotel, and for some reason, the air conditioner keeps going on and off, so I'm sorry about that. I can't turn it off. So let me start by saying, I think a couple of broader issues here, and I think about both sort of process and then I'll delve into substance. I think a lot more technology policy and some telecom policy questions are going to devolve to Congress. A lot of interest, both the Senate and the House Commerce committees on these questions. I think they'll play a more active role. I think also we're not going to know a lot about these questions until we know who is in which positions, who's at the FTC, who's at the FCC, who's at NTIA, et cetera. And lastly, I think we have to remember this is the first Republican, this is the first time since I believe the 1920s where Republicans have controlled all three branches, all three chambers, House, Senate, presidency. And I do think regardless of this sort of Trump populism, there is going to be a natural inclination and trend toward a kind of conventional Republican approach, which is generally lighter touch on regulation, less spending, and lower taxes. It's going to be some of the mantras there. Within the FCC, let me just say a couple of things. I think it's possible you'll see a narrowing, and a constraining of how FCC has worked in the past. Some of the narrowing of their jurisdiction. I don't know that we'll get full-blown Telecom Act rewrite, but I do think there'll be some pressure, and an FCC chairman from the Trump administration probably may likely restructure some of the bureaus, limit what the FCC does and how it does it. A few things on substance. Ellie mentioned net neutrality. I think that's essentially a done deal. Republican FCC chairman, I would imagine his first action would be to begin the process of overturning the open internet order. I will say this, and we said at the time, I think there was a deal that could have been cut a year ago for a legislative solution to that. That could have gotten relatively strong open internet protections without the baggage of Title II. That's now done. Simply no way there's going to be legislation on that, and I think administration will overturn that. The real question is, would they go for some kind of compromise? That would, as opposed to just doing nothing, will they have a compromise that would say, okay, unreasonable discrimination you can't do, and no unreasonable blocking, these kinds of things, or will they just say, nothing, no rules here? Set-top box regulation, to the extent if it goes forward, it's going to get overturned. I think you'll see a much more open attitude towards zero rating. I would imagine that the second step that the new FCC would do would be to overturn the Title II privacy order and just go back to the regular framework of FTC privacy oversight. I think you'll see, under Obama, you saw this expansion of universal service. I think you'll see a shrinking of that. And I think another area we'll see both within the FCC in terms of how they think about this, but also in NTIA to some extent, if they have any money on this, and particularly rural utility service and ag, they're going to be a real limit on overbuilding. If we're going to fund, I believe in a Trump administration, if we're going to fund broadband in high-cost rural areas, it's going to be areas where there's zero to little broadband already, and not get into this kind of notion that I think Wheeler has endorsed, which is more competitive overbuilds. That to me is going to be gone. Three other quick things: mergers. I think you'll see even though Trump himself has called into question Time Warner, AT&T, I think you'll see a more permissible approach to mergers. You might still probably wouldn't get just to pick an example, an AT&T T-Mobile merger maybe, but maybe Comcast T-Mobile, maybe T-Mo Sprint. I think those kinds of mergers that were off the table in a Wheeler Obama regime would now be back on the table. I think we'll also see that as emerge as we go to 5G, where 5G begins to look a little bit more like a wired network, big capital requirements. Not clear we can support 4 competitors in a 5G world. I would see the Trump FCC as being much more understanding of that new competitive reality and being willing to shift. A couple quick things on spectrum. I think the pendulum will shift more to licensed and property rights spectrum and somewhat away from unlicensed and commons approaches on spectrum. There'll be, I think, a more aggressive attempt to get federal spectrum out in the open for broadband. And then on infrastructure, I think there's just two last things. I think on infrastructure, it'll be very interesting. They announced, Trump announced today, the head of the transportation transition team, a woman, Shirley Wybera, who's a very accomplished transportation professional, known for years. She used to run the Virginia DOT under, I think, Gilmore. Be really interesting. I believe Trump's going to do a big infrastructure play. I think an interesting question will be, does he talk about and does he want to have intelligent infrastructure, or is it just going to be more concrete and asphalt, as opposed to smart cities, Internet of Things, embedded sensors, all of that? That'll be a real important test, whether how much this administration thinks about digital as opposed to just reflecting the old economy. On the last point on trade, I'm a little more optimistic maybe than Ellie on that. I think there's been systemic abuse of what we call high-tech harassment of U.S. technology companies. It's hurt our technology economy, whether it's abusive IP enforcement in these foreign countries, forced tech transfer for market access, just IP theft, massive unfair WTO unfair subsidies to our competitors. Trump's going to push back on that, and depending on how he does it, he could do it in a way that's sort of overly aggressive and ham-handed, or he could do it in a way that's more strategic and effective. I think if he does it in the latter, that ultimately would be a good thing for not just the U.S. tech economy, but the global IT system. Having these mercantilist policies, in our view, slows the rate of IT innovation in the world, makes it harder, not easier. So again, a lot of things that are unknown. I think the main thing we probably will know is this is going to be an administration where IT is not as privileged as it was in the Obama administration, where it at least got a seat at the table lots and lots of times. I think IT, telecom, tech is just going to be another seat at the table, more or less, and going to have to contend with that new reality. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are any immediate major questions for Rob, raise your hand and speak. Is that the way we work it, Jason?
That's correct, Bob. But
I do have there were some chat type questions, which I could quickly ask a couple if or no other questions.
Chris Savage has his hand up, Bob.
Then he should speak.
Hi. So, Rob, I appreciate your summary of what I took at the beginning of sort of the typical Republican set of things that we would expect to happen. One of the things that's been hard for a lot of people to gauge about this election is the degree to which Trump is not actually a typical Republican. And I'm curious as to whether you have any thoughts as to whether Trump the populist might get involved as compared to Trump the big business traditional Republican guy.
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question, and I think it will end up as sort of like a little bit of a division of labor. Trump's not going to do everything. He's going to he's going to pick his fights. He's not going to be a traditional Republican on trade. That's for darn sure. He's not going to be a traditional Republican on immigration. Probably won't be a traditional Republican on some big spending things like infrastructure. The Republicans they don't want to do that. They want to go more to what they call PPP, public-private partnerships, private infrastructure. So a little different for them on all of those, obviously. But I think on a lot of these other things where it's not a high priority for Trump, he hasn't campaigned on it. It's just possible he kind of will devolve that to people lower down, and those people will I would argue, tend to be in the more traditional conservative philosophy of how to govern, and you'll see a play out there. So the one area, maybe there's more, but one area that perhaps could throw a little bit of a monkey wrench into that, and that's a little bit of this kind of populism, kind of anti-big business populism that some of the Trump right appears to have. And Trump, for example, has made some comments about Amazon and killing Main Street businesses. You could maybe some of that gets infused in here somewhere. I'm not exactly sure sort of how, but I don't know. I tend to think the odds are more in some of these spaces. You're going to see more of a kind of traditional conservative free market approach.
Thanks.
I think we also had a question from Sally Hansen, and then Harold Feld, and then we'll go to Harold as a speaker.
I think you meant Sally Wentworth, right? Is that it?
Yeah, that's
Did
what
mean
I
Sally
heard.
Wentworth.
Okay, I didn't know if there was a Sally Hansen on the line. So,
I-
Rob, you had mentioned the sort of ongoing high-tech harassment. I like that phrase. And that there's potentially two paths to dealing with that. One, I think, as you said, more ham-handed, and one perhaps more strategic. What's your sense of the opportunity space, or what would be some of the more strategic ways in your mind that a Trump administration could help shift the pendulum back away from this kind of harassment you're talking about overseas?
Sure. Yeah. By the way, I also forgot just a 10-second commercial. We reissued a piece. It's on our homepage on sort of 70 different tech policy areas and what the Trump position is, if there is a position. So people can look at that. I think there's a lot of things that could be done. So one of those, partly it's just frankly the bully pulpit. If you think Trump is crazy, or like he's really going to do something, these countries will come to the table. If you really think this guy's going to put 40% tariffs on you, you're going to come to the table. You're going to start negotiating. So just sort of the threat of sort of instability in the global system. If you're a trading partner, that'll get you to the table. Has worked in the past to some extent with China, where they know that they can't do something. So there's that. We have a report coming out sometime soon on sort of what the next administration could do on China, and there actually are a lot of things. One example is if you really wanted to do it, you could invalidate Chinese patent protection in China for when they've done the same for us. So kind of a quid pro quo in a particular company or particular technology area. You could simply just refuse. You could cut off a lot of technology cooperation. Some people have talked about limiting access to our financial system. That one of the things the Chinese want, for example, is market status under the WTO. You say no, there's no way you're going to get that. The other thing Trump has talked about is building you could build a coalition with other countries that are a little bit more like us. You can really begin to say, hey, China, or to some extent Russia, to some extent India, Brazil, you just can't be part of this until you start to shape up. So anyway, I do think there's a lot more that can be done than has been done. You bring a lot more WTO cases. You're not going to win them all, but you can bring a lot more WTO cases. Case in point, right now, the WTO ruled 2 weeks ago against Airbus, saying that they had provided illegal subsidies for new airplanes, and that we have the right now to do countervailing duties. Haven't heard what the Obama administration would do on that, but I would think a Trump administration slap big duties on Airbus jets coming into this country. So, you could do things like that.
Okay, Harold, you had one question, then we'll move to you.
Well, I didn't really have a question. I simply echoed that Chris beat me to it. On the listening to Bob, you would think that Ted Cruz had won the election rather than Donald Trump, and it really, to my mind, goes to elites never believe that they are elites, and ITIF, which has in the last couple of years published these papers about how populist fears shouldn't be driving policy and it needs to be in the hands of us experts. I'm like, you do understand that Donald Trump ran against people like you and against ideas like that. One of the reasons, frankly, why the issues that we've championed in public knowledge in terms of things like open internet and in terms of privacy, set-top box, they are populist issues. There is tremendous support for them outside the Beltway. It tends to be only inside the Beltway that people start to become all like, that's not really going to happen. So, I think that the one thing I agree with Bob on is that the one with the middle initial, Robert D. Atkinson, sorry, ITIF, is that, in the first instance, Donald Trump is probably not going to take a very hands-on approach on these issues, that he's likely to delegate it. But at the same time, I think that the one thing he does listen to is his constituencies, particularly the little guys who he's been talking to. And they've made it very clear that they are not big fans of big business. They regard this as crony capitalism rather than something that ought to be regulated, which means that I think that it's very hard to predict right now which way things are going to go. I do note that while Donald Trump has mentioned broadband in infrastructure, and telecom infrastructure is something they're going to build, one thing that is on their list of top issues to do in the last 100 days is not repeal Title II. It's, review of regulations, blah, blah, blah. But, Trump's interest in this was a tweet in 2014. Now, again, my feeling on this is there are obviously going to be a lot of fights around things that were done under the Wheeler administration. There's a lot of momentum, particularly by the inside the Beltway elites who have been fighting this tooth and nail to roll these things back. And I think that certainly the folks that Trump appoints are likely to be more or less initially sympathetic. It's always hard to tell on these things. Many of them don't traditionally break down by political party. There will be a large grassroots reaction, I expect, if we see things like a complete elimination of net neutrality in Title II, where that was a very broadly based, people didn't like it when you screwed up their ability to get Netflix. People don't like it when you do things that look like they're favors for Comcast, AT&T, and other big companies. So I think that will factor into the mix. What happens, though, we'll see. I don't want to sugarcoat it and pretend that Trump is going to be a version of Wheeler. But the biggest unknown to me is how you reconcile these various conflicting trends within the Republican Party. To quote Hamilton, winning is easy, governing is harder. And I think that there will be a lot of conflicting instructions in the first couple of days. I think that it may well be that the initial reaction will be a very anti-regulatory one, but I do think that there will be a lot of pushback if it's too sharp a rollback on things that are viewed as important consumer protections. And I am, I'm not going to pretend that I expect that there will be no changes. I'm not going to pretend that it's not going to be a significant fight. But I do think that the view that Trump is going to walk in and undo everything in telecom that has happened in the last 8 years is its own brand of wishful thinking.
Harold, let me step in here. This is Bob Atkinson. Since we started it with a possible question and then you've gone into your speaking, I should have introduced you better, and I apologize. So if you don't mind, let me introduce you so that people on the call who don't know you, although that may be nobody, will know who you are. So let me say that Harold Feld is the Senior Vice President for Public Knowledge, one of the nation's leading consumer advocacy organizations working at the intersection of copyright, telecommunications, and the internet. Harold is highly regarded as a thought leader in the area of spectrum reform, antitrust, and broadband deployment, and he was previously a senior VP at the Media Access Project, a public interest law group, and prior to joining Media Access Project was an associate at Covington and Burling and clerk for the DC Court of Appeals. I apologize for interrupting, and let's continue.
Let me just, since I've seen some of the chat that I'm engaging in my own wishful thinking, let me put a couple of points where I think we are going to see some significant efforts at deregulation. I certainly think that the media ownership rules are very likely to be relaxed. I think that newspaper cross ownership in particular is likely to be a priority for whoever comes in on the administration. I think that, and generally sort of the older media rules are very likely to be, substantially relaxed in the new administration. I think that spectrum has become a lot more complicated just because the carriers themselves have moved into unlicensed as well as licensed. It's a much more complicated universe. There are a lot of issues and questions that are going on here. And I don't think that the licensed unlicensed dichotomy is as strong as it used to be, but you got to face the facts that auctions generate revenue. And so I think that particularly if we're going to see a strong reduction in the tax rate, which I expect we will, that part of the effort to try to balance that out will be to push for more spectrum auctions. So, that I think is certainly going to happen. But for me, the most interesting issue, which nobody's talked about for a while, is the tech transition, where we have the transition of the telephone system from the traditional technology to new IP-based technology. Some of those will be wireline to wireless. Some of those will be wireline to wireline. I think that that's very likely to be the kind of infrastructure project and public-private partnership that will occur, that a Trump administration is very likely to seize on and move forward with. Now, the question, I think, for a lot of companies is in all of these areas that people are looking at, do you try to completely roll back the existing framework, or do you take the framework and try to undermine it and make it much more friendly for corporations? I personally think that we're much more likely to see the second than the first. So take net neutrality. I think it is much more likely that Congress will try to rewrite the Communications Act and just rewrite Title II rather than, and simply get rid of all of the things in Title II that they don't like, rather than undo Title II for broadband, figure out something else. I think that while zero rating wouldn't be an issue if you classified broadband as an information service. I think that companies will push for something a lot more faster, which is simply looser policies on zero rating, looser policies on what discrimination means. So I think that we're certainly going to see a lot of deregulatory action, but I just think that it's much more likely to come through non-enforcement, lax guidelines, and efforts to deregulate within the existing structure rather than deliberately seek out huge battles over issues that, frankly, even the companies at this point, the carriers at this point, would rather see settled.
So can
Thank
I
you very
just
much.
respond to that, Bob? A little
I'm
bit?
sorry?
Harold had responded to me. Can I just respond real quickly?
Sure.
So a couple things, Harold. You said, Ted Cruz didn't win the election. Neither did Bernie Sanders. So I think if anybody hasn't read the new book by John Judas on populism, that's actually from Columbia, excellent little book, about 170 pages, super good book. There's a big, big difference between right-wing populism and left-wing populism. Net neutrality is a left-wing populism issue. It's not a right-wing populism issue. So I don't think it'll play out the way that you think it will, Harold.
Well, we'll have to see. It's certainly as Eli pointed out at the beginning, a lot of this is unknown. There will be a lot of advocacy. I think that you're going to see a lot of pushes from a lot of different directions, and I would say for us, look, we always work with Republicans. We work pretty much with anybody who's interested in working with us, but we also are pretty firm about pushing back where that happens, and we'll just have to see how it goes down. I do have to say, I acknowledge the irony of a book by a professor from Columbia that talks about populism. I just, not to put too fine a point on it, but
well, Harold, John Judas,
there is a certain amusement value. Doesn't mean it's not accurate, but I do
John Judas is not a
note
professor
the
at
irony.
Columbia. John Judas is not a professor at Columbia, Harold. He's one of the leading liberal journalists in New Republic and others who has a totally great reputation as a left of center progressive. So I wouldn't impugn John's ability to understand this issue.
Correction is cheerfully noted.
Thank you.
Do I have any other questions for for Harold? And I think he caught a couple of the chat comments and responded to those. So why don't we move on to our third speaker, and that would be Sally Wentworth, not Sally Hansen. And Sally Hansen, excuse me, Sally Wentworth joined the Internet Society, known as ISOC, in May 2009, and is currently the Vice President of Global Policy Development, where she leads the organization's public policy activities, guiding the development of public policies that support the global open Internet. Sally also leads ISOC's policy engagement in a range of international organizations, including the United Nations, the Internet Governance Forum, and the ITU. Sally.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you just fine, Sally.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So the speakers before me have spent a lot of time on the domestic scene. So what I thought I might do is speak a bit about the international and policies. And as Ellie noted, my area of expertise is on internet governance, so I will try to focus there. Like other tech policy areas, we don't have a lot to go on in terms of President-elect Trump's point of view, although he did make a very strong statement about, I guess it was late September, opposing the IANA transition. And I brought this statement up today just to refresh my memory, and it it provides perhaps some interesting guideposts. The first point he makes is that Donald J. Trump is committed to preserving internet freedom for the American people and citizens all over the world. I think that's actually going to be an important point that we'll obviously want to see fulfilled. Then the U.S. should not turn control of the internet over to the United Nations. And he goes on to speak about the fact that the U.S. created the internet, the importance of free speech, and the importance of not emboldening countries like China and Russia in their endeavors to promote online censorship. So there's quite a bit in there to look at and think about in terms of what that might portend for a Trump internet foreign policy going forward. Also looking at some of his advisors' statements, I think we get some interesting views out of Eisenach and others about what we might see there. From my perspective, the big areas for internet governance going forward will be on two main fronts. The first will be security issues related to cybersecurity, critical infrastructure protection, privacy, trust. The whole suite of security-related issues is a huge point of consideration at the international level, and a lot of discussion going on among countries in that arena.
The easiest
This-
way to do this is
Could somebody mute if you're not on mute?
Have a fixed incentive to raise the price.
The other area would be
All kinds of price
issues
escalators.
related to
We
access.
have, we can just use your regular, if their monthly bandwidth.
Jason, would you
usage
mind
goes up,
muting
we
whoever
can increase the
is speaking? Thank you. Hard to hear. The issues related to access and development, these have been, of course, first and foremost on a lot of developing country minds of how we grow the infrastructure worldwide, and what is the policy and regulatory environment to support that. And I should probably say third is really this role of the United Nations, role of governments, and particularly the role of international regulation when it comes to cross-border data flows and the internet in general. In reading, going back to Donald Trump's statement with respect to IANA and some of the other statements that we've seen on foreign policy in general, I think we should expect a very muscular foreign policy coming out of this administration, and I would expect to see that applied to the internet. His view, the U.S. created, developed, expanded the internet across the globe, and it seems to imply that the U.S. Should maintain or be seen to maintain a significant leadership role. I think he'll be pushing hard to maintain that. There are a lot of pressures around the world to see the U.S. stand back from this sort of unique leadership role. A lot of governments that would like to see a more even or level playing field when it comes to global internet policy. And I sort of wonder if a Trump administration will think that that's a good idea. On the other hand, looking at some of the advisors' points, I think we see a strong commitment to internet freedom, again, to issues related to online censorship, free expression, and being an advocate for internet freedom worldwide. So that could be certainly a very positive development. There are statements out there of support in general for the multi-stakeholder model, which would be, I think, something obviously my organization will be watching very closely. The Obama administration, the Bush administration before it, and the Clinton administration before it were very strong supporters of the multi-stakeholder model. So we'll be looking to see some early signals from a Trump administration as to how they plan to position themselves in the context of that model. On security, there's security issues at a range of levels. Of course, there's the levels of critical infrastructure, issues dealing with attacks like what we saw a couple weeks ago in the case of the Dine attack, and the role that government plays versus the role that the stakeholders play in solving for those kinds of issues. At the other end of the spectrum, you see issues related to cyber war, cyber defense, cyber terrorism, that are getting a lot of attention by governments. And I think we should expect, again, based on some of the writings that I've read by advisors, that we would see this administration playing a very strong role there. Those are difficult issues to balance against free expression and the stated goals in that regard. On regulation, there was just a big meeting at the ITU just last week, and we see once again a significant push by the international community to strengthen the role of governments when it comes to internet regulation, and strengthen that role further and further down into the internet stack. So choosing technologies, identifying standards, trying to preempt the rollout of things like Internet of Things so that it rolls out in the kind of way that governments would like to see, a way that gives them more control, gives them more influence in the technology. I think that's going to be a big issue for the next 4 years, and one that this administration will certainly have to grapple with. So that's, I guess, a high-level view on what I see on the international scene. I'm happy to take questions. Oh, I see Jolly's asking if the IANA transition can be undone. I am not a lawyer. I do not think so. I think that the transition is complete. The contract has expired. And the work is moving forward, so it would be quite difficult to claw that back, in my opinion. And then I see there's a question about FBI, Apple backdoors. Obviously, early on in the, well, I guess midway through the campaign with the Apple FBI case, Trump was quite clear that Apple should open up its technology to the FBI and allow for. So this is a call that we hear from governments around the world, a desire to have some sort of backdoor into encryption technologies. Certainly from Internet Society's point of view, not something that we support, something we think is very dangerous. And so we would hope that kind of policy would not go forward in the new administration.
Are there any other questions for Sally? Sally, I was interested in your remarks about the developments at the ITU. It seems to put the Trump administration perhaps in a bit of a dilemma, because I don't know that they have great affection for international organizations and international comedy even. And if that's the case, they would have to. Would they pull back on U.S. involvement in the ITU and leave, these fairly important issues to other countries to push back against Russia, China, et cetera? Or is the United States an essential player at the ITUs?
Well, I think you raise an important point. It's frankly a dilemma that any number of administrations have faced over the years. The ITU is generally seen as necessary for both the public and the private sectors in the U.S. when it comes to radio spectrum. It's the only place to go to get international allocations, and it's done via a treaty. And that treaty is developed on the basis of consensus. So you really do have to build international consensus and goodwill towards your point of view in order to be successful at a conference at that level. And countries are countries, and they play in all parts of the ITU. So to be successful in one part, you have to be seen, I think, to participate in the others. That's always kind of been the view. And then there were also, of course, longstanding U.S. policy interests in seeing the development of technology around the world and the international standards, et cetera. So it's possible that the Trump administration could try to pull back in pieces of the ITU and say this isn't in our interest, we're not going to play. But I think that would have spillover effects to where the U.S. may have a positive interest in the ITU when it comes to radio spectrum. So balancing those things out. And an organization like the ITU tends to work on the basis of consensus, or at worst, one country, one vote. So you've got to have, you don't have veto power. You have to be able to build a coalition in support of your point of view.
I'm not, I'm more worried now than I was before. Thank you. Are there any other questions for Sally? If not, I'd like to move on to our next speaker. Excuse me, Chris Savage. Chris is a partner and co-chair of the communications practice at the law firm of Davis Wright Tremaine. He's been in the telecom regulatory field for 30 years. He's currently an adjunct professor at the Columbus School of Law, teaching cyber law and data privacy. And Chris has been spending his legal career helping telecom, cable, and internet companies navigate the heavily regulated communications industry. So if it becomes less regulated, you'll be out of work. But maybe you could tell us why you see a long and happy future for telecom lawyers.
Well, a couple of things. Am I on? I can't tell from my own.
You are.
Excellent. Well, yeah, first, the obligatory disclaimer. I mean, my firm represents a lot of entities in this sector generally. They don't always agree with each other. They take different views on public policy issues. So let the recording reflect that anything I'm saying today is really my own thinking on this and shouldn't be attributed to any clients. So think of me as in my law professor mode rather than my advocate mode. At least in the short run, I think that the outlook is really good for communications lawyers. But the reason I think that is that whether we have a sort of standard issue Republican Trump administration or something else, I think it's inconceivable that there will not be a lot of support in the new FCC, however it's configured, to remove and cut back on some regulations that were put into effect or that were being considered to be put into effect under the Wheeler administration. And what that means is, on behalf of the industry, advocates are going to have to decide, look, what's out there that I really just want to get rid of versus what's out there that I want to tweak. And on the theory that we really don't have much insight into what Donald Trump himself thinks about these issues, as Rob Atkinson was saying, or as the other Atkinson was saying, you know, we don't really know. I've taken some time to read Jeff Eisenach's writings, and what I see from Jeff's writings on the theory that he would be very involved in this is sort of standard issue, intelligent, conservative-oriented approach to these matters, which is, as compared to, let's call it the Harold Feld, Gigi Sohn version of regulation, a great deal of skepticism about whether regulation can actually make things better. And so I see the advocacy taking place along the lines of, there's this big regulatory edifice that you will put into place, FCC, whether it's the open internet order, whether it's privacy regulation, you know, whatever it may be, and there's no reason for it, and it isn't helping things, and it's all speculative. And so it's putting a great deal of time and effort doing nothing good. So a lot of thought's going to go into what does industry want to have taken back, and second, I think it was Harold who made a very important point. If the populist world likes the idea of net neutrality as being this wonderful thing, then it probably doesn't make sense for industry necessarily to say, we want to repeal net neutrality. It's probably more effective to say, let's interpret this in the following sets of ways so that the practical impact on doing business is low. And whether that's zero rating or what other sorts of things that are just deemed okay under the, quote, still effective, close quote, net neutrality regulations, that would be fine. And on that level, the business has to decide, do I care about the bottom line or do I care about making a philosophical point? The philosophical point is deregulate everything. The bottom line is whatever's on the books, as long as it doesn't keep me from doing the things I want to do, what do I care? Another thing that I've worried about sort of staring at the election results coming in, the states are the laboratories of democracy. And one of the things that there's asymmetry in this in the following way. When you have an administration at the federal level that is in favor of doing regulatory things, which you've had for the last 8 years, then the states that tend to be deregulatory may sit back in frustration, but there's nothing that they do. States that might have a more regulatory bent can allow the FCC to do what it wants to do. When you have a deregulatory federal government structure, which I assume we're going to have, then states with interests in being more regulatory have an incentive to start looking at things that they can do, notwithstanding claims of federal preemption and all of that sort of stuff, to try to at least protect citizens within their borders as they see that come out. Now, the California is of course notorious since forever as being in this way, but I expect there are other states that might take the same view. I remember back in the 80s, I once applied for a job at in the law department of the California PUC, and their question was, how can we not be bound by these stupid things that Judge Green imposed? So trying to find ways to get around federal efforts at deregulation, I think, may be a growth industry for state regulators and therefore, of course, for telecom lawyers. The other thing that I'd like to suggest is to maybe put out for discussion. I think there's even within the traditional Republican view of the world, there are different strands that affect some issues that are now very high level. And short version, we can contrast a Powell version of the FCC and a Martin version of the FCC. The Powell version of the FCC buys into the notion of competition can and will solve our problems. And so the purpose of regulation is to ensure the existence of competition, even if that requires certain affirmative steps. Whereas I think the Martin version of the FCC, and these are short caricatures, the Martin version of the FCC is more be deregulatory because you can expect businesses to do what's in the interest of consumers by virtue of the operation of market forces. And if you study the economics and regulatory literature, there's an enormous amount of ink spilled and equations written trying to explain why the things that businesses with some degree of market power want to do to raise their profits also in the long run, in the great by and by, end up benefiting consumers. Now, I don't want to, and I would put Jeff Eisenach, for example, in that category. I don't want to knock that work. I mean, it's good quality work and it's intelligent, but it's very much sort of anti-populist. And so to my mind, even if we have a, quote, standard issue Republican, close quote, FCC under the Trump administration, I'll be very interested to see whether it's more like a Michael Powell standard issue Republican or more like a Kevin Martin standard issue Republican. Some other thoughts thinking about those kind of historical things that occurred to me. One of the big arguments that industry raised against regulation in the open internet order was, what's the problem? Look at what we're doing. We're not doing anything bad. The counter to that was, well, of course you're not doing anything bad. You're on good behavior. Everyone's looking at you. You're not going to do anything bad precisely because if you do things bad, people are going to want to regulate you. I suspect that the more thoughtful members of the industry will want to take that approach following any deregulatory activity by a new Trump version of the FCC, precisely to avoid stirring up populist attacks. Because the good news for industry that in Trump not having this front and center in his thinking is that standard conservative-like things can occur. The bad news for industry is if he doesn't care that much and it starts being a source of populist outrage, to go back to what Harold was saying, I don't get the sense that Trump certainly would have any problem with whacking down, established industry players because he'll get cheers from his base. So, you know, I could go on. There are lots of little nits, but to my mind, at a high level, that's going to be the very interesting thing to watch. Is do we have a more let's create competition version of standard issue Republican regulatory policy, or do we have a more let the companies do what they want to do because regulation, we are so skeptical of it, we don't know what's going to happen.
Thank you, Professor Atkinson. Do we have any questions for Chris? I saw a couple flying by on the chat screen. So let's see if, Harold, you thought Chris Savage scores. Fill us in on that. Why?
Well, I mean, I think he's right in contrasting the Martin FCC and the Powell FCC to point out that there are different flavors of Republican FCC. I do think that he mischaracterized both Michael Powell and Kevin Martin in the way in which they operated. I mean, I think that, you know, Michael Powell famously said that he thought deregulation was not a reward, you know, for eating your vegetables, but, you know, that it was the thing that created competition. So I put Michael Powell as being much more in the straight up just skeptical of regulation as creating any positive force. I do think, though, that it created, you know, there's difference between that and somebody who simply likes big companies. So, for example, Michael Powell was very supportive of the unlicensed spectrum. Kevin Martin, however, was much more a sort of traditional Republican in the sense of seeing that it was important to up consumer protection in areas where there was market power, that regulation could be an effective means of promoting competition. I wrote a piece about this back in 2007, which uses religion to try to compare these things, in which I said that Kevin Martin was you know, a member of the Church of Market Power Reformed, which meant that, you know, unlike the true Church of the Gods of the Marketplace, which believed that in any kind of regulation is inherently bad, that Republicans in the Kevin Martin mold tended to treat regulation as sort of chemotherapy drugs. They're poisons that you sometimes have to use to prevent, you know, really bad things, but generally you want to stay away from them. I think that you know, there are going to be a lot of folks who are going to want their constituency represented, all of which have various resonances in the Republican Party. And in fact, the one thing we haven't actually talked about, which Kevin Martin does bring to mind, is the indecency stuff, where you know, newly empowered conservative evangelicals are going to press very hard for that. That's a pro-regulatory thing, which requires that the FCC actually have some jurisdiction over median content. And again, I keep going back to there's you know, it's a very complicated world. It's been very easy for Republicans in the last 8 years to all pretty much agree that the Obama administration stinks and they hate it in all its works. But I think that I agree with Chris that the most prudent course that industry is likely to take is to avoid trying to stir up big fights and instead look for ways to gradually undermine the existing framework where they find it inconvenient and do what they do best, which is figure out how to manipulate the regulatory structure as it exists to their advantage. That's what companies do.
Any other questions? In which case, we'll go on to our last speaker, and then we'll open it up to some very, you know, general back and forth amongst both the speakers and the audience. So our last speaker, excuse me, is Scott Walston. Scott's the president and senior fellow at the Technology Policy Institute. He's an economist with expertise in industrial organization and public policy. and his research focuses on telecommunications, regulation, competition, and technology policy. His research has been published in numerous academic journals, and his commentaries have appeared in newspapers and news magazines around the world. Scott's been with a number of other think tanks, past, and currently working with the World Bank as a scholar at the Stanford Institute of Economic Policy Research, and was also with the President's Council of Economic Advisors. So Scott Walston, welcome.
Thanks, Bob. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. Yeah. So thanks for having me. And I guess just before I start, I want to also commend to everyone the ITIF piece that Rob Atkinson noted. I think, as far as I know, it's the only document that's tried to cull through everything that the Trump campaign said about tech. And of course, as Rob said, there are many places where he didn't say anything about it. But it's a pretty comprehensive view of what we know about Trump and his views on tech. So, having said that, I think pretty much we don't know what he's going to do. We can speculate about what a typical Republican would do and what these things might look like, but we have very, very little to go on with what a Trump, what he would like it. What policies he'd like to pursue in tech, or really almost anything else. And I think what a lot of it's going to depend on is how hands-on he is with the various agencies. He doesn't seem to have an overriding philosophy, not on tech and not on regulation. He focuses on very specific issues, whatever seems to interest him or upset him at any given moment. And let's take, for example, his claim that statement that he would oppose the AT&T Time Warner merger. So first of all, we've been told not to take what he says literally. I guess the line, maybe it was Maureen Dowd who said his supporters have learned to take him seriously but not literally. So we don't know if he will literally oppose that merger. But let's suppose that he does want to. What does that mean? Who does he appoint to the relevant positions at DOJ, for example? Is he going to look for somebody who generally is opposed to mergers? If so, that person's probably not going to come from the stable of Republicans who would otherwise be considered for those positions. On the other hand, it's almost impossible to imagine him finding a Democrat who he would appoint to that position. Similarly, with the FCC, if we, all the good money says that it'll be Jeff Eisenach as head of the FCC, everyone's read Jeff's work, and we know that he's generally a free market guy, and opposed to not all, but a lot of regulations. How independent would Trump allow this FCC to be? Trump's made claims about taking away licenses in response to things that have angered him. I'm sure that seems sort of unrealistic. But would he allow the agency to just be independent and follow, if it were Jeff, sort of a deregulatory approach, or would he take a more active interest in it? And if he did take a more active interest, what would that mean, given his lack of an overriding philosophy? And so I think we don't really know how to judge those things. Now, sort of going on to more sort of more specific issues. Sally mentioned trade. Rob did too, and I just want to emphasize that there was the campaign, of course, had lots of discussion about trade, and sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback from somebody. There, okay, and obviously generally opposed to trade, but will people consider digital trade to be part of that same issue? I'm not sure that's clear. Is digital trade going to get caught in this general anti-trade environment? I mean, it will, to the extent that it's part of trade agreements that might not happen. But will it be possible to separate it from trade in manufacturing, which is the sort of thing that his supporters get upset about. I mean, you didn't hear him going on about you know, how information is stored in multiple countries around the world, and having his supporters, you know, do a call and response on that at his rallies. So, you know, maybe that'll be considered something different, or maybe it will get caught up in just anti-trade movement. We don't know. We've now also on the infrastructure. He's talked about an infrastructure fund, just like Hillary did, and I don't think he said whether there would be specific technology aspects to it, but if there are, I would hope that it would be, you know, have very clear goals, and money would be distributed on the basis of the cost effectiveness of proposals, possibly along the lines of some kind of reverse auctions like the FCC did for the mobility fund, so that you can get the biggest bang for the buck. Um, and I think, you know, I think the biggest question that we all need to think about, and hopefully it will be part of this administration, is the relationship between technology and productivity. The question of why productivity has fallen and stayed low is the big question of economics, and the question that will determine whether we have sustainable long-term economic growth. And we want to think about ways that ICTs can work to make society more inclusive rather than being something that separates society further by socioeconomic class. Uh, and, you know, I don't know exactly how we do that, but so far we've seen social media give voice to people who are who feel disenfranchised, but not necessarily in a good way. And so, you know, I think we need to think about how technology policies have gotten us to where we are now, and ways that it can be improved. And I think part of that improvement will be, should be focusing, you know, on subsidy programs, for example, trying to make sure we focus on the margin. This is historically something that we don't want to do. We're happy to have programs that subsidize people to keep doing what it is they're doing. And you know, that's probably what the Lifeline program is largely doing. But we want Lifeline, we want to get the last people online. We need to figure out how to get, you know, what it is that keeps them offline. And you know, the FCC ran a bunch of great experiments, but then it ignored the results because they were so unexpected, which was that we don't really know how to get to this last group of people. And we need to answer that question. And I hope we'll do some of that. So I see that Chris asked what extent the productivity problem is a measurement issue. And Chad Syverson at Chicago has done some work on that. And you know, it's found that it's really a very small, it's real, but he estimates that it's a pretty small part of the issue. And you know, I think that sort of there are some people like Bob Gordon who thinks, you know, that it's all over. We're never going to invent anything new again, and productivity is dead. But I think sort of the more optimistic view, and one that I believe, is that you know, right now we're in a phase of companies trying to figure out how to use these new technologies, and you know, hopefully we will see a return to productivity once they're integrated into sort of more production processes, and we see you know, how to use machine learning and AI and stuff like that. But maybe that's just too optimistic. And he asks if lawyer productivity is a good thing. And I guess that depends on how you define productivity. But I guess I've gone on long enough. I think that's all I have to say.
Scott. But I think the last discussion about productivity is quite interesting in the sense that, you know, the big part of Donald Trump's base are the unemployed, underemployed, et cetera. A lot of the blame for that has been placed on outsourcing of jobs to China. I don't recall that there was a tremendous amount of finger pointing at technology and telecom, et cetera, as being the cause of so much angst among working people. But do you see that as that connection being made, and what sort of pushback from the populist side of the citizenry could we expect to have on telecom and ICT? In other words, do the Luddites come back?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you're right. We didn't see that that link with technology in in the campaign, and I guess we'll have to wait and see whether that becomes part of it or not. The question of Luddites is, we've been dealing with that for a while. I mean, people are worried about how AI or automation in general will affect labor markets. And and of course, we all know the debates about it. We've seen in the past that automation has ultimately generated more employment, but not necessarily in the short term. And so, it seems at a minimum we've got an adjustment problem to deal with, where real people are put out of work, and we're going to have to take that seriously. I think in the past, maybe we haven't taken these issues seriously enough. We always, as economists, we always say things, that we know that free trade is good. It makes us all, it makes the, as a country, it makes us richer and better off. And we say that, if the net benefits are positive, we should be able to take some of those benefits to compensate the losers. But maybe we haven't taken that last part of this seriously enough. And with this, with sort of adjustments, labor market adjustments in the future, we need to give that more serious thought. And I don't know what that looks like.
Any other comments, questions? Scott, look at the chat board there and see if there are any issues you raised while you were speaking.
Rob, Rob, this is Sally. If I could jump in, I'm interested, and I can't remember, Scott, if it was you or if Chris before you raised this issue of what a new FCC might do on the indecency front. I think taking into account the role that sort of the values voters played in this election, maybe particularly brought in by Vice President-elect Pence and that side of the party. I wonder if people have a view of what kind of role the family values or religious coalition will play, and whether that will impact regulation on things like indecency, and what people think that might look like. I hadn't really focused on that, but somebody mentioned it, and I find that interesting.
Anybody have any views? Jason, can anybody now just chime in, or how would they need to respond?
They just need to unmute, but sure.
Right, okay. One of the issues then, I just like to add to the conversation. Scott just mentioned, and a number of other speakers mentioned the name Jeff Eisenach. I'm wondering if all the members of our audience are both familiar with Jeff Eisenach as a thinker and as a writer on writing policies, but also that he has been, according to Politico, is leading the Trump administration's transition team on telecom, communications issues, et cetera. And Scott, for the first time that I'm aware of, you indicated that he's being touted as the new chair for the FCC, and that's new news to me, at least. So Scott, I'd ask first Scott just to confirm that he's actually is being touted for the FCC chairmanship, and then I would ask the panelists and others who know Jeff Eisenach in any greater detail to just talk about some of the things he has written about and whether those are likely to become a substantial part of the Trump agenda.
I probably shouldn't have spoken like that. I mean, we know that he's an advisor on tech, and I thought I'd read somewhere that he was being considered for chair of the FCC. Maybe not. It just sort of seems like a perfectly reasonable guess, though, that's where he would end up. in an administration. This isn't based on any particular knowledge. It's just based on my willingness to say something completely unsubstantiated.
Well,
This is Chris Savage.
let's be provocative and let's assume, just for the sake of discussion, that a guy like Jeff Eisenach is in fact becomes the FCC chairman. For those of you who are familiar with Jeff, is that good, bad, indifferent? You think it's a good idea?
Well, first, on behalf of
Bob, who do you recognize? Hello?
Abe?
Well, I don't hear anybody. This is Ellie, so I will just speak. Jeff, of course, he comes from the Progress and Freedom Foundation, which had been associated with Newt Gingrich, and I assume that the Newt Gingrich connection, him having played a major role in the campaign, is part of this. Jeff is a kind of a positive and deep thinker on free markets, but Trump is not a free market kind of a guy. He's an industrial policy kind of a guy. He is not a free trade kind of a guy. So Jeff would have to be able to adjust the free market impulses with the industrial policy impulses.
Yeah, this is Harold. You know, there are a couple of issues here. I'll just start with, I had something of a argument with Jeff some years back on whether we had solved the rural broadband problem with satellite. And Jeff's attitude was that satellite solved the broadband problem for everybody. That's not a position that's consistent with what Trump has been saying about telecom infrastructure. It's certainly consistent with the a more free market approach that looks very narrowly at what ought to be the basic service that's provided. But again, as Eli just pointed out, that's not what Trump has been selling. I also think that, as Chris mentioned, one of the problems of appointing somebody who is an ideological person rather than a practical politics person is that you end up picking a lot of fights and making a lot of noise. It may certainly be the case that Trump may decide, well, Jeff, because he's also a guy who's big into loyalties, he may decide, well, Jeff was one of the guys who stepped up when nobody else was interested in stepping up. And decide to give him chairmanship of the FCC. I think if that happens, that we will have a lot of very high-profile fights. And I remind folks of what happened in the media ownership stuff back in 2003, 2004, when Michael Powell decided to just go ahead and do what he thought was the right thing, regardless of popular uproar. So it's possible. I also have to point out that most frequently, when you have presidential appointments to the FTC, they're not people that anybody has heard of. That's not always true, but nobody had really heard about Reed Hunt until he was appointed chair of the FCC. We've seen also that being chair forces you to change your position on stuff. So I think we'll have to see. I think that, for all we know, Trump has promised it to Ann Coulter or somebody. So, that's the problem with an unknown, is you really don't know, even if they're not deep into this, what they're going to do about it.
Chris Savage, I think, had some observations as well. So, Chris?
Sure. So first, I mean, the idea of Ann Coulter as head of the FCC is sort of frozen my brain circuits for a second. But putting that aside, one of the challenges that I think having someone like Jeff, and I also saw reported somewhere that Jeff was in line to be chairman of the FCC. So I don't remember where either, and maybe it's just floating around in the Twitterverse, but I'll verify that I heard it said. Second, and interestingly, I think that there's if we have strong free market economics deciding what's going to happen at the FCC, you run into problems, which is that the logical free market answer is often very, very unpopular. Way back in the day, meaning 30 odd years ago, I worked for Bell Atlantic, a Verizon subsidiary, and it was widely understood in the industry that the logical way to price phone service when it was all regulated was called Ramsey pricing, where you look at the people who are least likely to turn off their phone service and you charge them as much as you possibly can, because then everything else is cheaper. And that meant that the little old ladies and the moms and dads would be paying much more for phone service than any regulator anywhere would tolerate. I think that there are similar things today where the logical economic answer is or can be hugely unpopular. And it may be that it has to work its way through in terms of the FCC proposes something, people yell and scream to their congressman and senator, who then yell and scream at the FCC. But I'm skeptical that pure free market thinking is going to work, not because it's wrong as a matter of the mathematical economics of regulation, but because it becomes wildly unpopular. So that'll be interesting to me. There are limits to what free market economics can accomplish politically, which is why, going back to what I was saying earlier, the companies are going to do well to be on good behavior for a while, irrespective of what the regulations would logically permit.
Anyone else on Jeff Eisenach and what he might represent?
This is Jolly. I've got one question, which is about Muni Wi-Fi. We saw it, not allowed, knocked out. Surely it's a free market issue, and although Trump has said on other issues he'd leave it to the states.
Anyone got a comment on that? And more broadly, in fact, perhaps the whole question of a rise in state influence on policies in the absence of federal preemptions, not only on muni systems, but in other matters where local state regulation could be involved.
Yeah, this is Rob. I have a comment on that. So I think one way, and Harold, I'm looking forward to your response to my comment here. One way you can think about what the Wheeler administration has done, particularly with a push from the sort of telecom populist, is really to constrain the private sector ISP for-profit model, constraining them in the following way, putting them in a Title II box, limiting their ability to innovate around data and different kinds of privacy models and business model offerings around the use of data, whether that's through privacy or zero rating, and encouraging alternatives that are public or other kinds of non-profit cooperative alternatives, particularly muni broadband. I think what you'll see in the Trump administration is the polar opposite of that. I don't think you'll see an administration that wants the government deeply involved here. I think so when it comes to muni broadband. I don't think the administration will fund muni broadband projects unless they're sort of muni broadband projects of very last resort. I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to go back and read Jeff Eisenach's excellent report of it must be 4 or 5 years old now, an analysis of the NTIA and RUS stimulus package spending on broadband and how much of that was on overbuilding. In other words, subsidizing communities that already had private sector broadband. That was something that this administration wanted to do, partly because they privileged competition, induced competition, I should say, and they privileged, they wanted more government provisions rather than private sector. I think you'll see the exact opposite approach in the Trump administration. And I will say one last thing on this populism question. I think it's kind of in one ways that is a central question, is when populism emerges or in areas where there is a populist presence in the administration. There may be lots of things that have nothing to do with populism because they're just inside the beltway. Nobody cares. They'll be decided more on interest and ideology. But on this broader political question, I really think it's a question of, is it sort of a right-wing or left-wing populism? Right-wing populism both here and abroad, is really largely about race and immigration and about trade, and it hasn't been about technology. And I think that's really an interesting question, whether it'll kind of continue to have that separation or not.
Very good. I understand, Chris Savage, you had some thoughts on one of these, this topic.
Yeah, I think we actually, going back to my earlier comment about a Powell versus Martin version of Republican regulatory policy, we had a little bit of a test of this back in the day when universal service high cost support was first made available to competitors. The economically logical thing to do, it has always seemed to me, is if the federal government is going to be providing subsidies to one competitor, those subsidies ought to be available to other competitors in different modalities, which frankly, Jeff Eisenach's relatively recent report in the European context emphasizes you need to be technology neutral and outcome neutral. And what happened is in the early days of the wireless revolution, which I'd call, you know, the early aughts, mid-aughts, it became clear that for relatively rural areas, it was just a lot cheaper to give people service with a wireless phone than to run 10 miles, 20 miles of copper to their house. And so wireless companies getting designated as ETCs for an area could make enormous inroads into the market because they could build out their infrastructure and compete with the rural ILECs. Of course, this was unacceptable. And the founding fathers assured that it would get fixed by making sure that the rural states have as many senators as the urban states. And so the political opposition to actually funding competition in rural areas on a competitively neutral basis was astonishing, and it went away. So under the Martin administration, under the Powell administration, there was indeed competitively neutral funding for high cost support for wireless and landline. That was recharacterized as waste under the Martin administration and was killed. But to my mind, this whole notion of overbuilding versus non-overbuilding, if you're doing industrial policy, you say, I want to make sure there's broadband in the hinterlands. If you're doing, and fund somebody to do that. If you're doing pro-competitive policy, you say anybody who wants to can have access to this money to go compete in the hinterlands. Those are very, very different policies, both of which are at least arguably Republican in nature. And I'll be very interested to see how that plays out in the Trump FCC.
Thank you. I've asked for questions to be propounded on the chat line.
I did just want to respond since Robert D. Atkinson had asked for my response on the Muni broadband stuff, which is to say, you know, I've worked with folks who are actually interested in deploying systems and municipalities that are interested in deploying systems, and they tend to be in prime red country. And so this is one of these where, you know, setting aside what has become the doctrine view that all of this is somehow manufactured by the great Google overlords. And I have no doubt at this point that people like Robert D. Atkinson believe all of that and don't need to debate it here. But I have to say that the primary interest in municipal broadband, certainly back
Harold,
when...
Harold, I got to interrupt you, okay? Don't say things like that, Harold, okay? You don't know what I believe. Don't say what I believe. You can ask me what I believe. I do not believe that. Don't say that in a call like this, please.
Well, I will point out that you have referred frequently to asymmetric, you know, technology privileging regulation. I would say that I have a number of disagreements about how these things are characterized, which is part of what I think will be interesting to see what drives. But again, just specifically on the Muni broadband point, a lot of the drivers come out of red country. And it is viewed by people who are actually trying to deploy these systems as populist issues of local money going to local services. And so while I certainly agree that the federal government is unlikely to take a quick dive into this, but I expect that there will be a lot of interest in it. There will be a lot of interest in public-private partnerships. And this is another one of these areas where I expect, what Chris Savage has referred to as the great laboratories of democracy to start looking at things now that the federal government is likely to withdraw.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions coming in over the chat line. Two of them are, I think, fairly related, so maybe we can address them as one. Maria Garcia Murillo asked if munis are not likely to be supported. How about universal service programs? And then Brian Savin asks, assuming President Trump has a goal of building out fiber access on a universal basis, how would he most likely go about it? And when I put the two together, is universal service money transfers the best way or a good way or a likely way for encouraging rural and other sources of unserved areas with broadband, vouchers or direct payments to consumers? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Well,
apparently not. Oh.
Well, hold on. Look, I think that there's always interest in ways that don't involve money. And, while what's scanty on the infrastructure stuff is, public-private partnerships, how are you going to manage, we'll somehow do this. It is going to be a question of how you manage it. Now, there's a lot of interest in 5G and wireless fiber. And will that work? Potentially that could be a great driver of bringing the cost down of delivery and change the economics some. I think that there are certainly a lot of things to explore with regard to what have been commonly talked about as infrastructure changes on both sides that don't involve spending a lot of money. The dig once policies are a classic example where you've had folks on the left and the right who have pushed for these kind of infrastructure policies. But I certainly think that the constituents who elected, the people who elected Donald Trump because they felt the government was ignoring them, are going to want to see some action on this and have an understanding of how they're going to get what people think are essential services.
Thank you. Had a question from Tom Oust. Not much discussion of effects on Silicon Valley players, Google, Netflix, as well as Netflix, Amazon, that are driving OTT and its ramifications. Are they losing privileged status in DC? Thoughts about the privileged status of Silicon Valley?
So
I'll jump in on that if nobody else wants to, or maybe even if they do. So first of all, I think that on a raw political level, I think it's widely known that Silicon Valley, on the whole, supported the Democrats rather than the Republicans. And so if we have, Donald Trump as vengeance seeker as our model, they will certainly lose their privileged status in that sense. On the other hand, I think that we have seen in this election in particular, but also in previous ones, the power of the services that the Silicon Valley group represents, Facebook, Twitter, so on, to influence the election or to influence political activity. I don't think we have yet really seen what would happen if Silicon Valley interests started using their services and platforms as a pulpit to advocate their interests. We saw a little bit with the SOPA PIPA fight. We saw a little bit with some other isolated things. But I think as a socio-political matter, putting aside, our specific topic, it will be interesting indeed if the Silicon Valley interests feel threatened by the federal government and by its policies, what they can and will do to try to influence policy back. I mean, if Facebook is supposed to be unregulated and not interfered with and blah, 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 and Facebook decides that it doesn't like something Washington is doing, I'd be interested to see what happens. I'd be interested to see what happens if Google begins to feel threatened by government activity rather than feeling like it has a seat at the table.
Yeah, well,
I don't have answers to that, but I think we may be in for some interesting times if there's a significant pushback against Silicon Valley.
well, I guess there's actually, I guess.
That was a very important. This is Mike Nelson. That was a very important comment, and I'm right now driving through Silicon Valley. There is a scenario where, particularly if a Trump administration decides that there need to be more laws requiring law enforcement access to telecommunications, sort of Scalia 3.0, and if it means decrypting traffic, then you could see a huge upswelling, partly instigated by the industry, partly from the grassroots, partly from groups like Herald's. But I don't think Trump will go there, but that's going to be one of the biggest issues, both in the U.S. and abroad. What kind of law enforcement access is required?
Can you imagine logging on to Facebook and getting an editorial message from Facebook? Hey, you all should know that the government is trying to do X, which is bad for you and bad for Facebook. Call your congressman. Click here.
Well, how about?
And that's exactly what Wikipedia did with SOPA.
Well, and that's
Correct.
the kind of thing
How
that,
about hang on a second. How about the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos? And that obviously has an editorial view, which is well read inside the Beltway. Ellie, you had some thoughts. I know you put your hand up.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Bob. I think
And
that
Sally.
in some ways, Silicon Valley had a strong seat at the table, which they're not going to have as strong for domestic type issues, inside Washington type issues. On the other hand, Trump also stands for Make America Great, and Silicon Valley is really kind of a crown jewel in that effort. And so I think on the international scene, actually, I would think that there would be more push by the US government in support of these companies.
Sally, I think you.
Except that we don't hire many people. That's the one challenge. There aren't a lot of jobs in Silicon Valley when you add it all up.
well, I think, I was interested, Mike Nelson, this is Sally, to your point, there's an interesting transition, and people have hit on this, that happens when you go from a populist campaign to one that has to govern. When it's one thing to be on the outside and talking about, conspiracies and the government is trying to do this, that, and the other thing. And then once you're in the government and asking the government to do certain things, I have to imagine that part of the community that supported Trump would be very unnerved to see the government wants to read your Facebook traffic at the top of a Facebook page. So I think Trump, it will be very difficult for President Trump. I'm not saying he wouldn't go there, but I think with his own base constituency, that would be a very difficult move.
Also with respect to anonymity.
Right.
I mean, I think, gosh, what the government wants is to make sure that instead of your name being, deplorable 52, no, you're John Doe, you live at 153 Main Street, and you post the following things, and we're reporting them in to the FBI every day.
No one's mentioned his comments, though, about going after ISIS and stopping online recruiting. That involves monitoring. That involves getting rid of anonymity. This is a huge issue.
This is the thing. It's one thing to say these things in a campaign, but then when you are the government, when you're, it's one thing to rail against the government. When you are the government, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, it was
going to be fun time.
Chris, if you could, I was just about to jump in on a comment on that for no other reason than it all depends on how this gets couched. If President Trump basically says we have to fight ISIS, we have to root out radical Islamic terrorism, and we're going to do it by monitoring internet traffic to find where these people are, his supporters may all of a sudden be very okay with Google traffic being watched and Facebook traffic being monitored and all that, because it's to stop the bad brown people, which is who they're afraid of.
Let's not get into
Well,
those needs.
I've,
But
I've got one here. So Trump wants America to be #1. So if, say, the OECD shows that we're lagging in broadband, that might encourage him to get into, infrastructure issues. And I'm just looking at the European digital agenda, and they have, like, certain things that they set out, talking about Harold's dig once, like, certain, more transparent permit granting procedures. All new buildings have to have, ducts and access points, these kind of policies. Do you think he might do something like that?
That sounds like
This is Harold. Yeah, I mean, I think that's been, where there has been a lot of emphasis from folks who are opposed to, direct government either building of systems or subsidizing systems. There's been a lot of these infrastructure type developments. There's also been a lot of resistance. I mean, it's one thing to talk about dig once in the context of federally funded roads. It's another thing to say, well, every new building ought to have something on it. Then you get, pushback, typically from landlords who say, well, no, we should have a right as the private property owner to, have exclusive contracts and, companies pay us to get access to our customers. We will see this fight as microcell deployment becomes more substantial in the context of next generation wireless, where, right now people pay for rooftop rights. When you need lots and lots of microcells, it becomes quickly very expensive, and where companies worry about exclusive deals for access, and where we're likely to see calls for, some kind of, federal preemption on these rights in the name of infrastructure deployment. So, I think that it's very likely that there'll be bipartisan agreement on some of these infrastructure things, similar to what they've done in the EU on things that are not about wholesale or unbundling, but are about pure, building stuff and giving access to stuff that's built like conduit. And we'll have to see when we get to building access, however, whether how things work out on that front.
Well, building access is also a potential area where different states can do different things. I mean, one of the things that was fascinating back in the old days when the 96 Act first passed was realizing the degree to which state law gave, quote, utilities, which CLECs counted as, different rights. I mean, there were certain states where, by virtue of getting your CLEC certificate, you acquired the right to condemn easements on private property. And that wasn't a federal law matter. That was a quirk of different pieces of state law. So if again, picking states that have liberal reputations, if California or New York or, whatever, Massachusetts decided they wanted to solve the problem of building access, there's nothing that would prevent a state from passing a law that says wireless providers have the right to condemn easements for reasonable compensation on the rooftop of anybody they need it from. Now, I don't know whether that would actually happen, but that doesn't require federal action. This is one of the many areas where actually I think, notwithstanding general federal preemption of things like broadband writ large or other sorts of things, there's actually a role for different states to do different things, essentially without any federal involvement at all. Not that it'll happen, but it's one of the reasons, to go back to Bob's point introducing me, I'm fairly bullish on the prospects of telecom lawyers going forward.
Okay, we're approaching the end, so I'd like to move fairly quickly. One practical question that I've received privately on the chat is the Time Warner AT&T deal And I guess it's somebody who might have an interest in that deal and wants to know, is it going to go through as presented, go through with heavy conditions, or is it dead on arrival? And I've heard odds and ends of the Time Warner mentioned so far, but does anyone have a yes, no, simple answer to that question? Time Warner, AT&T.
Well, it's one of the few things that he put himself on the line, and so it would be very difficult to walk back from it.
So that sounds like dead on arrival. Any other thoughts? Okay. Any other quick questions?
Yeah, this is Heather Hudson. I had my hand up, but I don't know what the priorities are.
Okay, go ahead, Heather. Make it quick. We've only got a few minutes.
Okay. Two quick comments. I'm sitting on the edge of Silicon Valley in San Francisco. I think that the comments made were quite right in terms of the companies being perhaps seen as part of the problem in privacy and security if those are considered strategic tools of this administration, but also part of the solution in terms of American dominance in tech. So I think what's likely to happen is that the Silicon Valley companies will have to sharpen their skills, which they honed a bit in the previous administration where they were listened to a lot, but have realized that being in Washington and being very visible is important. The other quick comment I'd like to make about infrastructure and rural infrastructure is I think there's a danger perpetuating that the focus will continue to be on funding, CapEx funding, if any, and no attention paid to OpEx. And what I'm seeing now is that pricing and affordability are really the key issues, even where some infrastructure investment by public or private sector has been made.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. Any other comments or questions? We have 5 minutes, so I'd ask our speakers if they have any last very brief comments. So I'll start with you, Ellie, then we'll go through the order in which everyone spoke.
All right, thank you, Bob. I thought that was really great, really informative. I think in some ways we tend to go back to inside the beltway type issues on occasion and forget that in some ways Trump is a bit like Ronald Reagan, that he's a big picture kind of a guy. And so one should stick to his big themes. And the big themes is make America great, jobs, to some extent rural America, and whatever works in that direction is going to drive. He's not a competition guy. He's a builder. We'll see actually much more of perhaps a republicanism in the Teddy Roosevelt type mode of kind of doing things, of activism, rather than in the deregulatory, hands-off, laissez-faire way of republicanism, which is why he had a problem with much of the Republican Party. But he's president, and he's going to push that.
Rob Atkinson, last thoughts.
Sure. So I think I'm much more of the view that this is going to be in the telecom space. It's going to be more of a continuation of kind of what we've seen from Republican administrations. Trump is different than the Republican establishment in a number of very, very important ways, which are going to play out in a lot of conflicts. Public spending on infrastructure, but I don't think that's going to be on broadband. I think it'll be on roads and things, trade, immigration. But I think these questions are going to still be inside the Beltway issues, as much as Harold doesn't agree with that. They're going to be elite-driven issues. They're not, the people who voted for Trump didn't vote for Trump because their broadband speeds weren't high enough. I don't think they care. And this will be, I think, much more conventional Republican views on markets, competition, and the government role.
Thank you very much. Harold.
Well, we'll see, won't we? I think that broadband has become a much more bread and butter issue for Americans. It's something that everybody's using. It's something that everybody pays for. I think that the issues are not going to go away. That these have been big fights, and they will continue to be big fights. And we're going to, telecom is no longer a sleepy little elite field. Some of it is technical and some of it's hard, but there are a hell of a lot more people who are interested in it. And I think that we will see how that shapes the future.
Thank you very much. Sally.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult, as it is in any issue now, to separate President Trump's internet policy from his broader administration policies, whether it's on national security, foreign policy, justice, counterterrorism, et cetera. So I think, again, looking at an international perspective, how the stance that the president takes on international organizations, on consensus building, on foreign policy in general is going to have a huge spillover effect on internet policy. And I think we'd be foolish to see that only as an international issue. That will have implications for the domestic scene, and we should pay close attention to that. And I think as the discussion on encryption highlights, it's a real unknown about how Trump, the campaigner, shifts into Trump, the governor, the president, and governing, and how that plays out on an issue like law enforcement encryption and the relationship with Silicon Valley.
Thank you very much. And I think our last commenter is going to be Chris Savage. I have received an email from Scott Walston that he's having some technical difficulties. So, Chris.
Well, then let me make a suggestion that we should all watch a truly deeply inside the Beltway phenomenon. I just saw on Twitter that in Washington, D.C., 4% of the people voted for Trump. Now, an awful lot of FCC and related agency staff employees are not Trump voters. And I'll be very curious to see the degree to which there is open or much more likely passive staff level resistance to doing things that the Trump administration wants to do. John Kennedy apparently once famously said he was lobbied for something and he said, "That's a great idea. Now I want to see if I can get the government to go along with it." And I'll be interested to see how that phenomenon plays out, at least in the early days of a Trump administration.
Very good. And Scott, just in case, are you able to speak? No, apparently he's still having the technical difficulties. So I'd like to thank Scott. I'd like to thank all of the speakers. I think it's been an amazingly interesting 2 hours, actually. I was a little concerned that we wouldn't be able to fill up 2 hours, but this is probably going to take 2 years to figure out. So thank you all very much, and I appreciate the audience and everyone else. Thank you very much. Oh,
Thank
Ellie?
you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And I think it's going to be 4
Thank you, Bob.
Ellie?
Thank you, Bob. I think it's going to be 4 years.